Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
True fun is the confluence of three factors. Those factors are playfulness, connection, and flow. So very similar to what you were talking about as well. So playfulness doesn't necessarily mean that you have to play games. I think a lot of adults recoil at the idea of playfulness, and also that seems just very frivolous and childlike. So it's not that. It's really having a lighthearted spirit and not caring too much about the outcome of what you're doing, doing things just for the sake of doing them. Not succumbing to our perfectionism, because we're such perfectionists as adults. We think we can't do anything unless we're really good at it. And that needs to we need to let go of that in order to have fun. And then connection is the feeling of having a special shared experience. And one thing that was interesting in my research is that, while I think that it is occasionally possible to have true fun alone, in the vast majority of stories people told me, there was another person involved. And that was true for introverts too. In fact, a lot of people said, because I asked them, is there anything about what you just told me that surprised you? A number of people said things along the lines of, I'm a self-proclaimed introvert, and yet all the stories I told you, because I asked them for 3 stories, all involved another person. And then flow is the state of being so engaged in what you're doing, actively engaged, not passively. We're not talking about like sitting on the couch and getting hypnotized, but actively engaged, that you lose track of time.
Hola. Welcome to episode 98 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrained community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So, if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.1/CultureBrained. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. So here is a crazy story. I was working on my second book a while ago, and the main thesis of that book was basically that there was no one-size-fits-all when it comes to company culture. Because, when you think about it, every organization is different. And so it's only logical that it would require a different culture to be successful. And I had plenty of data to explore as I'd interviewed hundreds of people in dozens of organizations around the globe. And so I dig into the data, and what I discover, to my horror and dismay, is that there are some themes emerging, especially for companies with high engagement, high profitability, innovation, retention, and so on. And when I looked closer and started coding the data, it was pretty clear that while thriving cultures were certainly unique in many different ways, they also had one important thing in common. They were built on 3 pillars: fun, meaning, and belonging. Now, meaning and belonging, they have been extensively covered by researchers and writers, but fun? Not so much. And that's how I found my guest today, because I started researching who else speaks about fun. And I found Catherine Price, an award-winning science journalist. Her latest book is called The Power of Fun: How to Feel Alive Again. And when I started reading it, I discovered something astonishing. We've arrived at almost the same conclusions when it comes to the nature of fun. So you can only imagine how excited I am to introduce Catherine to you and to talk with her about the power of fun at work. So with no further ado, here is my fun soulmate, Catherine Price.
I'm Catherine Price. I'm a science journalist and the founder of ScreenLifeBalance.com and author of books including How to Break Up with Your Phone and my newest book, The Power of Fun, How to Feel Alive Again.
I love this book and I'm super eager to share how I found it and how I came across your work. But before we go there, there is one question that I ask all of our guests. So let's start with that one. Can you please tell me what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person?
I think I've always felt that I'm a little bit out of touch with culture as most people experience it. So I don't really watch movies or watch TV shows or engage in that way. I think probably my cultural influences as a child was just reading a lot. I read a lot of fiction. And then as I got older, got a lot into nonfiction. And then had the privilege of having Michael Pollan, the science journalist, as a mentor in journalism school. So
I'm such a big fan.
He's amazing. He's a wonderful person on a personal level too. And so that shaped me. I think also I grew up in Manhattan. And so growing up in a big city, being surrounded by that kind of energy and then having access to all of the cultural institutions of New York really had an impact on me. And this desire to explore the world and constantly be learning and trying new things. And I think that though it's not an organization, my mother, she's very much committed to exploring and trying new things. And I definitely follow in her footsteps.
That sounds amazing. Oh my God, I'm so envious. Growing up in Manhattan, I can only imagine. Must have been such a great experience. And Mark Pollan, oh my God. Okay, so before we start, I really want to dive into your book, your new book, because this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I want to share how I came across your work and this book, because it's a really funny story. So I was doing research for my second book. And it was a book on culture. And my thesis was basically that there is no one size fits all when it comes to company culture. You know, horses for courses. Every organization is different. Every company is different. And so I really deeply believed that all these arbitrary models and frameworks that say you have to be like this or you have to be like this, they don't really make a lot of sense. And so I did a lot of interviews, like hundreds of interviews with people in various organizations. And I sat down and started analyzing the data and hope that my thesis would be proven right through this process. And then to my horror, I realized that there were some patterns emerging, particularly among companies that had high profitability, high innovation, high employee engagement, were really successful in the market. And so what it seemed like was that all the healthy cultures, they were unique and different in many different aspects, but they were all built on 3 pillars. So these were the foundations basically of a thriving culture. And these pillars were fun, meaning, and belonging. And yeah. And so the moment I realized that, I was like, okay, let me see what's out there when it comes to fun, like what research has been done, you know, and who talks about this. And so hard, first of all, to find anything.
It's so hard. There's so little. I mean, one of the top hits I got on PubMed, the biomedical database, was a paper called Putting the Fun in Fungi. It was a paper about toenail fungus.
Exactly. So I was desperate. And then I came across you and I was like, oh my God, this is crazy, because you found very similar stuff to what I have found studying these organizations. So yeah, so I want us to talk about this and compare notes, you know, and do a deep dive and help our listeners wrap their minds around this notion. And I guess the first question that I have for you, Catherine, because you've been speaking on this topic for a while. So I'm curious, do you get as much resistance as I do in the corporate world when you talk about fun? Because in the corporate world, the first reaction I get when I say, okay, let's talk about fun as one of the foundations for a healthy culture, people are like, I don't know, do we really? I mean, maybe we can, you know, focus more on meaning or belonging. What reactions do you get?
Well, in my case, I'm mostly doing talks in front of companies that have invited me. So at least someone at some level is into the idea. I get the sense that people are very responsive to it. But I also know that there is a common pushback that people have against the concept of fun, where they think it's frivolous, or they think that, sure, it's nice if it happens, but it shouldn't be a priority. Or you think, oh, there's so many serious things we should be paying attention to. We can't possibly prioritize fun. There was this mistaken notion that you can't care about serious things and then also care about fun. So I think that that's the traditional pushback I get. I've had a number of interactions with people who have invited me to speak to their organization where they describe themselves as kind of having been reformed. One person I was speaking to recently said that he had been a teacher. It was an organization of teachers, and he was saying he himself used to think that schools should not be a place for fun, which, struck me as crazy that would be something someone would think. But this guy clearly was very fun, and he said he's totally changed and come around to the idea. So I think that I interact with a biased audience, but I would say in general, the pushback I get is that it's frivolous, or it's going to make us look bad if we're caring about fun when we're also supposed to be caring about all these more serious things.
Yeah, especially when you put it in the context of work and fun. I think that's it creates cognitive dissonance, I think, for a lot of people. And
yeah. And I think there's a mistaken notion also that in order to create fun in the workplace, you have to do something like model your office after Google's and everyone's on a scooter. And
yes,
there are
table
pickleball
tennis,
courts, right?
Friday pizza
table
parties.
Tennis. Exactly, which I think gets fun wrong. And on both sides, both the employee side that's like, wait, I'm supposed to be happy because there's a table tennis thing in the office. And then on the employer side where it's like, why are we doing this? There's a lot of mistakes we make when it comes to fun.
Totally. I had a conversation today with one of my clients. I'm doing a keynote for them. And so we went through the 3 pillars. And the first comment was, well, about fun, we just need to be careful and position it carefully because we've had this issue over the past few months during our company events with people who were drinking excessively. And so we don't want to just convey the wrong message. I think it goes back to your point, that it really, the associations that people have sometimes, especially in the work context, are not ideal.
And just wrong too, right? It's like fun is not getting totally trashed and doing embarrassing things. I think that speaks to how we get fun very wrong, which we can talk about. But if you actually take the effort to define fun, as I try to do in my book, and then think about what that really means, it does not have to at all mean having an alcohol-fueled embarrassment.
Exactly. Yes.
That's not a good idea. I think we all can agree on that, right? Like no one say, what you need for your company is for everyone to get trashed and then do things that are going to post things on Twitter. That's not a good no one should do that.
No, don't do that. Okay, so I do want to talk about how you define what you call true fun. But before we go there, what I'm also curious about is what was your journey to even, focus on that topic so much? How did you arrive at fun, and what made you feel so passionate about it that you decided to write a book? Because I know how much effort goes into writing a book, and I know that you really need to be very passionate about the topic to take on this commitment.
Yes, it's always a multi-year commitment that you don't realize you're getting into. The Power of Fun is actually a direct follow-up to my previous book, which was How to Break Up with Your Phone. And that book was inspired by my daughter when she was a baby, and my realization that even though I'm not someone who's ever cared about social media, much to my book agent's chagrin, I just can't bring myself to really care about it. I was looking at other stuff on my phone, and I was very distracted by my phone, as we all are, because that's what our phones are designed to do to us. And I had these moments with my daughter when she was a baby when I would notice that she was looking up at me as I held her in my arms, and I was looking down at my phone. And it horrified me on a number of levels, including just the impact that was having on our emotional bond. I mean, I'm a science journalist by background, and so I just kept thinking of these studies of the impact of not making eye contact with a baby. Anyway, so that inspired me to write How to Break Up with Your Phone, which is all about creating better boundaries and more intentional relationships with our devices. Not about dumping them completely, but boundaries. And once I had done that, perhaps unsurprisingly, I ended up with more time. I freed up hours a week, sometimes even hours a day that I was no longer frittering away on my phone, which would seem like a great thing, except then I suddenly realized there was a bigger problem, which is that I'd gotten so used to distracting myself, whether it was by my phone or by just all the things we keep ourselves busy with in the day-to-day, email being a big culprit, that if I took those things away, I actually didn't really know what I wanted to do. And that came to a head one day it was a Saturday afternoon, and my husband and I were taking a 24-hour break from our phones and screens, like a digital Sabbath, which I highly recommend people try. And I was actually sitting in this very same room I'm speaking to you from. My daughter was napping and my husband was out of the house, and I had this hour, a beautiful, glorious hour I could do anything I wanted to with. And instead of reveling in that, I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm not sure what to do. And that ended up launching me on a journey that led to the power of fun. More specifically, I ended up asking myself a question that I was asking people who were helping me research how to break up with your phone. And that question was, what's something you say you want to do, but supposedly don't have time for? And one of the reasons it's an important question to ask is that before the pandemic, the best statistics I found indicated that the average American was spending upwards of 4 hours a day just on their phones, not on their computers, not on their TV, just phones, which adds up to 60 full days a year and is a quarter of our waking lives. So that's a lot of time. And in my case, my answer to the question of what I want to do but supposedly don't have time for was to learn to play the guitar, because I have a musical background and I play piano, but I just never gotten around to learning the guitar. I had one my grandmother gave to me, and I was very close to my grandmother. Anyway, long story short, when I signed up for an adult guitar class, I started to feel this feeling in the Wednesday night class that just carried me through for the rest of the week. It was this boost in energy and this feeling of buoyancy and joy that wasn't about the skills per se. Like, it was fine that we were learning how to play guitar, but there was something that was happening in the room of being with these other adults. It was in a children's music studio, so it was a lot of parents without our kids, BYOB, but not like excessive BYOB. We were not getting drunk, but just like felt very rebellious, I guess, on a Wednesday night to be with a group of adults learning how to play guitar. Anyway, the best word I could come up with to describe the feeling that I was having was fun. And that got me very curious about, well, what is fun? And how can I have more of this? And then when I started looking into the research, as you were saying, there really isn't research on fun, and there isn't a good definition, because what you read in the dictionary, it says things like fun is lighthearted pleasure and enjoyment, which is true, but there was something much deeper and more life-affirming going on. And so that launched me on this journey that led to me writing The Power of Fun.
Amazing. So I want to quote you to you, because I think you present such a beautiful definition of true fun in your book. And I just love this passage. And then I'll ask you to elaborate from this point. So you say true fun, I realized, is the feeling of being fully present and engaged, free from self-criticism and judgment. It is the thrill of losing ourselves in what we are doing and not caring about the outcome. It is laughter. It is playful rebellion. It is euphoric connection. It's the bliss that comes from letting go. When we are truly having fun, we are not lonely. We are not anxious or stressed. We are not consumed by self-doubt or existential malaise. There is a reason that our moments of true fun stand out in our memories. True fun makes us feel alive. Wow. I mean, this is amazing. And
I should have had you do the audiobook. It was lovely.
I don't think so. Not with this accent, no. So first of all, thank you for the book. It's an incredible book, and you define true fun so beautifully. I wonder whether you can elaborate on the differences of true fun. When we think about the everyday understanding of fun, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, that when we think of fun, everyday kind of fun, even scrolling our phone, sometimes people say, yeah, I'm just having a little bit of fun. So how did you land on this definition, and how is true fun different from the common perception?
Sure. So that was sort of my more poetic description of the feeling of true fun. But then I wanted to go into another level of like a more practical definition, because I tend to take my personal issues and turn them into professional projects. And then I try to use that to improve my life. So I was like, okay, great. I figured out I want to have more of this feeling, but what is this feeling? So I took it a step further, and I actually tried to break apart what you just read to find a concrete definition. And the concrete definition I came up with, which I then tested with all of the people on my mailing list. I had a big group of people I called the Fun Squad, and I had them share experiences from their own lives that they had considered to be, quote, so fun. And then I asked them to try to define fun. And then several pages into this survey, I mean, these people were so kind to me because it was very long, but several pages in, I then proposed my definition to check it with them, but without biasing them. So the definition, which they affirmed they felt correctly describe their own experiences as well, was that true fun is the confluence of three factors. Those factors are playfulness, connection, and flow. So very similar to what you were talking about as well. So playfulness doesn't necessarily mean that you have to play games. I think a lot of adults recoil at the idea of playfulness, and also that seems just very frivolous and childlike. So it's not that. It's really having a lighthearted spirit and not caring too much about the outcome of what you're doing, doing things just for the sake of doing them. Not succumbing to our perfectionism, because we're such perfectionists as adults. We think we can't do anything unless we're really good at it. And that needs to we need to let go of that in order to have fun. And then connection is the feeling of having a special shared experience. And one thing that was interesting in my research is that, while I think that it is occasionally possible to have true fun alone, in the vast majority of stories people told me, there was another person involved. And that was true for introverts too. In fact, a lot of people said, because I asked them, is there anything about what you just told me that surprised you? A number of people said things along the lines of, I'm a self-proclaimed introvert, and yet all the stories I told you, because I asked them for 3 stories, all involved another person. And then flow is the state of being so engaged in what you're doing, actively engaged, not passively. We're not talking about sitting on the couch and getting hypnotized, but actively engaged, that you lose track of time. So the most quintessential example is an athlete playing a game or a musician playing a piece of music, but you can also have flow, in a conversation or while you're working on a work project, but it's a state of total absorption without distraction. And what I came to realize is that each of those states is very good for us on their own. And each of those states, playfulness, connection, and flow, do have research behind them. And then when you experience all 3 at once, I think of it as being the center of a Venn diagram, where that's what I call true fun. And the reason I called it true fun is to distinguish it from many of the other things we do, quote unquote, for fun, that are marketed to us as fun, sold to us as fun, but that don't actually produce playful, connected flow. And as you just alluded to, one of the main culprits in that regard is social media. So one of my main arguments in the book is that we become much more precise about how we use the word fun, because what we do now with the word is to just apply it to all sorts of different contexts, and that dilutes it and obscures the fact that true fun, this feeling of playful, connected flow, is an incredibly energetic, life-affirming state. The other thing I like about defining fun as being a combination of those 3 states is that takes it from being this feeling, because I think it's a feeling, not an activity, it's a feeling that you can only achieve if you go outside your normal life, like on vacation or something that costs a lot of money, transforms it into something that can be achieved and experienced in our everyday lives. At work, at home, walking down the street. I mean, once you make it be playful, connected flow, it really expands the possibilities for having more moments of fun in every area of our lives.
Catherine, do we need all these 3 elements to happen at the same time to experience fun? Or is it possible to experience just flow, maybe without connection and playfulness, and define it as fun? Or do you need all 3?
I think you need all 3 for it to be true fun, but I think you can have the combination. You can have, playful flow, playful connection, and those can be beneficial things on their own, or enjoyable things rather, but they're not, by my definition, true fun. I should also say, I separate our leisure time into 3 categories, and we've talked about 2 of them. Fake fun, which is kind of, as I said, the stuff marketed to us as fun that doesn't actually produce playful, connected flow. And then you have true fun, when we actually do experience all 3 of those states. But then there's this big middle category of activities we enjoy, but that don't necessarily produce full-on fun. So for example, I've seen so many people, when I ask them about their thoughts on fun, at first say reading's fun, and then they stop without me saying anything, and then they think about it, and then they think, I'm actually not sure reading is fun. I really love reading, but I'm not sure it's fun. And so I believe there's just this big category of stuff that we truly enjoy, that we find nourishing or enjoyable in some way, and therefore should continue to prioritize, but that doesn't fall into the definition of true fun. Reading, taking a bath, doing something that's more kind of restorative or rejuvenating, but doesn't have the same confluence of these 3 factors would be enjoyable.
Yeah. And I'm sensing that this glue that brings it together more than anything else is connection. I don't know if this is your sense as well, but it seems like, you can have flow, you can have playfulness on your own, but they don't feel like fun. So you really need another presence and a common experience, a shared experience with someone to turn these things into true fun.
The connection can be that little special sauce that brings it to the next level, because you can have a perfectly nice time alone and really be enjoying yourself. But to have fun, you do need the connection. And I think that shows up in our habit of taking pictures of moments where we're enjoying ourselves alone and then wanting to share them. And that's one of the sad things about social media, is that our desire is genuine. We want to have that sense of connection. And I think that is because we're hoping to tap into this feeling that I call fun. But it doesn't do the same thing without the person there. I also think the baseline state of flow, that's well, all three are essential, but flow is one that so many of us, especially leaders of organizations or people who have a lot of demands on their time, really need to work to achieve, because anything that distracts us will kick us out of flow. And I'm biased because How to Break Up Your Phone obviously gives you a sense of what I think about this, but we're so distracted all the time by our devices. So if you're just constantly allowing yourself to be pinged by every new email and every new news notification, you're not going to have fun because you're not going to be in flow.
This is great. And I want to dive deeper into how to create more flow in our lives. But first, I want to circle back to connection and what you have just said about connection, because I think one question, of course, that is on everyone's minds right now, especially when it comes to the context of the workplace, is what do we do now? Because I think a lot of companies turned to remote first models during the pandemic, and suddenly they found themselves in a place where there is no going back. And perhaps the thing that they can reach is a hybrid model, but definitely not back to the office. And so a big question on everyone's mind is, what do we do about connection? First, I was asking people, what is an environment that allows you to do the best work of your careers? And then when I started identifying these trends, I went back and interviewed people around these three pillars. So I was asking questions about fun as well. One of the questions that I asked is, please tell me a story of one of the times that you had loads of fun at work. What did it look like? Just describe the situation to me. And the majority of the situations were situations where people spent time together in the same room, in physical proximity, not a lot of remote working together with others. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts or whether you have come across any research, whether it's possible to create that kind of connection that creates a sense of true fun, and B, do you even believe that it's possible, to do it remotely?
I do have thoughts on that, but I wanted to ask you first, can you share like an example that stands out to you as a story someone told you about having fun in the workplace?
One of the stories, it's so interesting because what struck me, and then I read your book and I realized that this was one of the things that you found as well, is that the moments of fun at work are not moments of pleasure at work. And it's usually a story of overcoming a challenge. That was a typical story. So, for example, one of the stories that I remember vividly, perhaps because it's a story that I can identify with from my previous career as a consultant in a large consultancy, was from a financial consultancy that basically people were working on a project, a big proposal, a big tender for a client with a really short deadline. It seemed like it was impossible to pull it off. And the moment that they were getting ready to submit the document, they realized that they were missing a whole section. And so half of the team already went home, and then they needed to reconvene and create that final section. And so need to call people to come back to the office and then spend the whole night, so pull the whole nighter creating that whole section together. And there was just a crazy amount of laughter and jokes, and sort of jokes that only made sense to this group about what was going on and what they were going to put into the section. But eventually they've managed to pull it off and submit the proposal on time. And they said, looking back, it was hard, but also it was so much fun. And it really brought us closer together because we felt like we were so close from failing. And so we were running on adrenaline, but then somehow we pulled through and we were able to do it. And I think what helped them from many of these stories was the fact that there was a lot of humor and a lot of levity, and diffusing the stressful situation by using humor. So actually, when I break it down in my framework, I have 3 levels. So there is individual level, interpersonal level, and then collective, sort of collective norms. And that interpersonal level, what I've identified was what's really important when it comes to fun is humor and levity. So it's like you cannot possibly do these things when you are super serious and just, it's
Right.
just, putting your nose to the grindstone. Yeah. So yeah, it's about difficulties and hard work, and definitely a sort of an experience of, we're really going completely outside of our comfort zone. So doing something new, doing something very imaginative, and having fun in the sense of there's a lot of levity, there's a lot of humor, so that we don't drive ourselves crazy and don't get frozen. Because I think there is that danger always in a situation like that you get into the fight or flight reaction and get so stressed that you just can't perform. So humor plays a really important role there.
Right. There probably was someone on that team who was good at bringing that out, because you could have the same situation where people were just incredibly stressed and not able to bond. But I think that's interesting because it's kind of a natural team building exercise, when companies get sent to the woods to like do trust falls and stuff. But in that case, it's like, all right. I mean, it's the premise of all of these reality shows and competition shows. It's like you've got a team and you've got a purpose. And in this case, you're not baking a cake, you're trying to do a work project, but you have a timeline and a deadline. And I think that also helps, as the night wears on, erode some of the formality that might exist in the workplace context, and people's personalities might come out in a way that actually made it more fun because they were letting their guard down a bit. So it makes sense to me that would stand out as fun. Now, obviously, that is much harder to do in a virtual context. But to go to your question, I do think that it's possible to create more sense of connection with people online. And then you can try to make that sense of connection translate into the in-person context. I would say, first of all, I think that if a company is trying to figure out a new normal in terms of when people should come to work or not be in the office, I think that it makes a lot of sense to try to have people be in the office on the same day, as opposed to totally having it be scattered. I was just listening to a talk by someone from NBC, and I don't know if this is universal across the entire company, but they were saying that there was a structure where it was, I think, Mondays and Fridays were the optional days to come into the office. And then the 3 days in the middle, people were supposed to be in person. But they also had defined, here are some things that you probably should do on your virtual days, the types of things you should do. And here are the things that we recommend doing on the days when you're in person. So there's actually a purpose to it, because it makes no sense to get people to come back into the office and then have them being just, have them sit in their offices and just be on their computers doing the same thing they could do at home. That's arbitrary. So the office days really should be, the priority should be giving people to achieve those little connections. I think there's a lot that can be done in the office too, in terms of having a physical space that is conducive to that, like a place where people can naturally gather, a nice area, so that they're incentivized to want to be in a shared space as opposed to just going into their individual offices. But in terms of the virtual stuff, I think it depends on the company and their culture. But I think you can, just as an example, one company I spoke for recently, they were telling me stories of their own culture, and they have a tradition that they call round the horn, which is apparently a baseball thing, where players toss the baseball between bases before the game starts to kind of warm up. And they have a tradition, a ritual at this company where before every meeting they do a round the horn thing. And what that translates to is each person in the meeting gets 2 minutes to share something that's going on with them. They can be as personal or as not that personal as they want to. You don't have to be incredibly vulnerable if you don't want to, but some people might choose to be. And then you toss the metaphorical ball to someone else in the group. And they just spend a couple minutes doing this before meetings. They do it before board meetings. Everybody has to do it. I think it was the brainchild of the CEO. And they really create these bonds between people just by setting aside a little bit of time in a ritualized manner for people to connect with each other. I think there's also creative things you can do with the breakout rooms, and actually taking time to, I think that there's a lot to be said for doing something as a ritual. I can talk more about that when you ask about recommended books, but that is what creates your culture, is these shared rituals and traditions that everyone kind of comes to expect, that start to function as this glue that creates bonds between people, so that you actually have this feeling of belonging in the company, so that it's not just a group of separate people working at a company, but it's a community and culture of people. So the ritual might differ depending on what your company does or what the culture is. One thing I found useful when I do webinars, because as you no doubt know, doing a webinar is hard, especially when you can't even see the people who are there. I've done a number of webinars where I'm literally looking at a black screen and all I can see is the little green dot of my camera, and I have no idea. But one thing I've been asking people to do is to start the meeting in the webinar by dropping something into the chat that delighted them today. And it doesn't matter how big it is. It can be tiny. There's a lot of things like my first cup of coffee, or the sunrise, or the rain this morning, or whatever. And this is an idea I got from a book called The Book of Delights by this poet named Ross Gay. And I just love the idea of this practice of noticing delights. So I did it kind of experimentally at first on one of these virtual webinars to just see what would happen. And what ends up happening is it starts slow, and then all of these delights start to fill the chat. And the thing about delight is that every time you read someone else's delight, it sparks a little bit of delight in yourself and a feeling of connection with the person who shared the delight if you have experienced something similar. And then I also encourage people to share delights with each other throughout the day. Like, I think it's a good use of technology to have a delight text chain or whatever. Anyway, in the company context, doing something really simple like that at the beginning of a meeting where you have some question, it doesn't have to always be the same question, but something that people can even just answer on the chat if you don't want to take up too much time, or if it's a small meeting that you can just go around. Little things like that might feel forced at first, but actually they go a long way in helping people connect with each other and see each other as human beings. And then that lays the groundwork for fun, going back to your point of how important connection is. And then I think also the more details you know about a person, then the more fodder you have for the playful banter and the ribbing or whatever that made those people feel very close when they were working together. And just as one more example, I recently hosted a gathering for my daughter's classmates' parents, and, well, the kids too, but we were trying to create a sense of community among the new second graders. And I asked people to, on their name tags, write down not just their name, but their favorite children's book, just as I thought that, might learn a new children's book. And also you can ask them about that instead of the normal small talk. And that was helpful. And then we also had people write down a hobby that they had or something, an interest that any kind of interest on like a flashcard. And then when the conversation kind of had a dull moment, I was like, okay, let's pull out these things and see if we can figure out like who is the jazz saxophonist, right? There was a jazz saxophone. And it was this woman named Sam, and she told this really interesting story about auditioning for conservatory, like a blind audition. And then she got in, and then when she showed up at the school, they said, we're looking for Sam. Sorry, this can't be you. And she's like, it's Samantha. It was this very interesting detail that I now know. And I know another woman has a sister who's a witch. I wouldn't have known that if we hadn't had this little prompt, And so what I noticed is even running into these people at the back to school night a couple nights later, there was this immediate sense of connection with the people who had been at that gathering that didn't exist with the people who hadn't been. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that even though it felt a little forced at first, we offered something that gave people a way to offer a little bit about themselves. And then that enabled a connection between the group. So I think each person can reflect on what this might look like in their organization. But as a concept, figuring out ways to help people get to know each other a little bit better in a personal context is very helpful. And doing it in a way where it's not about laying all your issues on the table. It's not about that. Like, it's not about oversharing, I guess is what I'm saying. But it's about making people seem more human and not just having them be totally defined by what they're doing in the workplace, but just to know a little bit more about them, because that's what helps create connections, then lead to caring about each other. And then that also can lead to more context in which you have fun.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it goes back to, when you think about what shapes cultures, and we say it's common experiences, but if you can't create these common experiences in the physical world, the next best thing, really, it makes total sense to me, is to create memories or share memories of these experiences and things that we share, like what's delightful in our lives. And I love the fact that you bring that to the forefront, because I think delight and surprise are memorable. And that's how you create memories with people that maybe you haven't even met in person, but there's this moment, this spark that sticks in your minds, and you're like, yeah, oh, her sister is a witch or whatever, or this is the person who is the saxophonist or whatever. And it's just, it just sticks. And then you feel like you have a bond with this person because they are a little bit more than just an avatar or a head on a screen.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, as one other example, I don't know if I recommend this because I personally hate this exercise, but I recently had a very belated book launch party because my book came out right when Omicron was beginning to surge. And we did this belated book launch party salon type thing with a variety of performances and people sharing things they were interested in, kind of like adult show and tell. And there was this guy who was like, oh, I have an idea. I'll do a mirroring exercise. If anyone's taken a theater class, this exercise where you have to look at someone and then you put your hands up and you move your hands around and you're trying to mirror each other, right? For me as a as a child I was extremely introverted as a child, and this stuff like makes me so uncomfortable. And I was like, okay, we're just going to do it. And I think a lot of people felt that way, but this guy led it really well. And there's this very funny thing where my husband ended up paired with this woman he's really never interacted with. But he's been joking ever since that. He's like, well, Marin and I did that mirroring thing. Like, we don't even need to talk now. Like, we just have a bond. And it was just so funny. And I've heard that from a number of people. So I think that we're wired for human connection, and we so desperately want it. And it can come out like, it doesn't take much to elicit it. I also think you just touched on something really important, which is that shared experiences are what create the groundwork both for culture and for fun. So if you can facilitate something that's a shared experience, I mean, not necessarily like the all-nighter where everyone is really stressed, but I've spoken to companies that actually have budgets for this, where they basically have programs where if an employee is really passionate about something, there is a budget so that they can organize an event around it, and then like-minded people in the company can join and do something together. So I think that that's a really interesting thing to contemplate.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Again, I don't think that alcohol and a workplace culture are what should be mixed necessarily, but if we were to use that example of you're saying the difference between having a happy hour where people are standing around and chatting while they get tipsy, right? And like how painful that can be, which is that's why everyone's drinking so much, because it's painful, versus having something that's like a mixology class. Even if it wasn't even alcoholic, if it was like, here, we're going to make some cool drinks out of like botanicals or something, and having people engage around that, you can feel a difference in the energy in gatherings like that. And then what comes away from that is that people have a shared experience, and now they have a bit of shared knowledge, and they did something unusual together. They probably got to know each other in a little bit of a different context. And they have this just, I keep using the word fodder, but this fodder for future connections, for future banter, for future playfulness, for just things they can experience together.
Totally. You used to do, for example, team building events where we would take people out in the middle of nowhere and do other stuff as well, like strategic sessions. But then they would have a cooking lesson and they had to cook their own dinner. And it was so much fun. I mean, you could see really people who normally wouldn't spend time together. They created a meal together. Some of them had no idea how to cook. And it was a subject of conversations a year after the event or even longer. And definitely you could see that these bonds were still strong after a long time.
And I think that also makes the point that one of the mistakes I think companies make is this feeling you have to force fun on people. Like, how are we going to make them have fun? And as we're talking about, you can have things that don't sound on the surface to be very fun, end up feeling fun. One helpful way to think about it instead is that you're trying to create opportunities for or empower people in your organization to create opportunities for playfulness or connection or flow, right? Kind of breaking it into those three pieces can help you escape the idea that you have to force fun on people, because I like to joke that fun is like romance, right? Like you can light some candles for it, but if you try too hard, it is going to run away.
Oh, I love it. This
right?
is so true.
So just think like, what would be a little bit of playfulness? I mean, one idea that came to mind when you were speaking about ways to create a sense of bonds between people and opportunities for fun, which would work virtually or in person, would be to kind of refigure the tradition of Secret Santas, if you have that in December, right? And do a version of it using the delight idea, like December delights. And the idea might be that you're assigned a person in your organization, maybe it even switches every week, I don't know, for December, where your goal is to do something each week that delights them. So you have to get to know a little bit about that person so that you would know, like, what could I do that would bring a little bit of delight for that particular person? Do they have a favorite, like, pastry or favorite coffee drink that you always see them, like, could you then go to the shop ahead of time and say, when that person comes in, like, this is on me, or do something that's just going to give them this little jolt of delight, because that's going to make you feel really good too. And I think really, obviously would create connections between people, but foster this feeling of lighthearted connection that can really lead to a shift in how people feel about being at the company.
Totally. I love it. I'm stealing this idea, Catherine, for sure.
Yes, use it, not stealing.
Thank you. Okay. I want us also to talk a little bit about the joy of work itself, because these things are, as you say, great fodder for other stuff happening later and lighting some of these candles. And it might feel like something separate from work, but there's also a lot of fun that people can experience whilst doing work. And I think flow is definitely a really important element there. So I wonder if you can speak to this a little bit and tell us, like, how can we bring more flow into our work lives? Because as you say in your book, we live in the times of time confetti. You talk about how, when you look at people's calendars, it's these tiny slivers, like 15-minute meetings, 30-minute meetings, and the calendar is full of these, and there is zero space for deep work, for creative work. what can we do? Like if you are a part of an organization that has a lot of meetings and you are required to participate in these meetings, like how do you create flow?
Oh yeah, that's a subject of a a long subject. I will say one thing that struck me before I get into that. The idea that people think you can't have like fun and work are separate really is crazy. If you think about how you feel about things that you consider fun, you want to do them. You have an intrinsic motivation to do them because they're fun. So if you can incorporate that feeling into a workplace environment, you're going to be more productive and more creative and happier about it. So it makes no sense to think these things should be separate. We should be prioritizing, like, how can we make work feel more fun? Because then you're going to enjoy it more and be more productive.
Yeah, totally. I don't know if it was in your book, Catherine, before you answered the question, just on that topic, the research about people who are prompted to perform a task by someone saying, this task is going to be a lot of fun, and the control group that didn't get that prompt. And apparently it was a difficult task, actually. But people who are prompted with that one sentence, it's going to be fun, they, I think, tried harder and stayed longer on the task, like 12% longer or 20% longer, something like that.
Oh, wow.
If it wasn't your book, then it must have been Primed to Perform. Yeah, it's a book that I would definitely recommend. It's really great.
I think the thing I mentioned in my book was the idea of, it was a study done on kids who were told to stay still, either just stay still and just use their willpower to do so, or to pretend that they were guards that had some kind of role. There was like a pretend play kind of aspect to it. And I don't remember the degree of difference between the two groups, but the kids to whom it was presented as if it was a game were able to stay still and stay on task for far longer than the kids who were just told to do it as a task. So yeah, I mean, research like that, I think we intuitively know it from our own lived experience, but when you look at studies like that, you're also like, why are we not internalizing this? I think we have a lot of guilt around fun and all the guilt around enjoyment and this puritanical streak. Although I read this book called Puritans at Play that posited the idea that actually Puritans were more playful than we tend to think they were. So maybe this is all just ridiculous and we should cut ourselves a break and allow ourselves to have some fun.
Totally. 100%. Yeah.
Anyway, to answer your question about flow, I think there's a lot of things that can be done. One thing that stood out to me when you were talking about meetings. So meetings interrupt flow. So I would say that if you're the leader of an organization, maybe trying to better define what meetings are for. So, I mean, everyone should have a clear idea of what they're supposed to achieve or have done by the end of the meeting, instead of just having, say, a standing meeting on the calendar that doesn't have any defined purpose. Because in the meeting itself, you want to have flow, but you also need to have a reason to be there. Otherwise, people are going to be checking their email on the side and just kind of like, it's going to be meaningless. So becoming much more intentional about that. But whatever you're doing, I think there needs to be much better boundaries between what you're doing in your head and then what interruptions you're allowing from the outside. And again, by far the biggest source of interruption is going to be the stuff coming through our digital devices. In the workplace context, it's often email. Listeners, do you all leave your email programs open in the background while you're trying to get something done? Because even if you silence the dinging, which you definitely should do, you're still going to be conditioned to have part of your mind on that email inbox. And you're probably in the habit, as I certainly am, or worked on this a lot, but had been, about, quote, taking a break from whatever task you're trying to do. As soon as it gets challenging, you just do, Control Tab over to your email inbox and check your email. And then you look up 20 minutes later, even 5 minutes later, and you're like, what just happened? What was I doing? And then you have to get yourself back on task. So there's a number of practical tools you can use for actually blocking distractions and blocking notifications for set periods of time. So I think one thing you can do is to try to structure periods of flow or I should say structure opportunities for flow into your day. The first step is to carve out chunks of time during which you will not be distracted. And if you're a leader in an organization, you need to actually tell people this and create guidelines to help support it, provide them with the tools, help them learn how to use Do Not Disturb. There's something for Gmail called Inbox When Ready, which allows you to hide your email inbox so you can be in your email, but you can't see the new messages. And that actually makes a huge difference in being able to protect your time. It hides the little, on the Google tab, if you do have it open, and normally says how many unread messages there are, it will hide that. And you can actually just go into your email, search for what you're looking for, do what you need to do, get out and not be distracted.
I didn't know that one.
Yeah, it's actually really helpful. Inbox When Ready. There's also just the general etiquette around email. I'm kind of obsessed with this in the workplace context because I think that people are starting a little bit to recognize that It really interrupts people's lives to get emails at all hours of the day that they need to respond to. But now I see a lot of people putting little things in their email signatures that say, if you receive this out of working hours, don't feel you need to respond. And every time I see that, I think your heart's in the right place, but the effect is the same. And it makes me think of something I read in David Allen's book, Getting Things Done, where he points out that one of the most stressful things for our brains is to have what he calls open loops, where you have some task that needs to be completed that's now in your head. So anytime you send an email out of work hours, and even if you say that nice thing, like you don't need to respond, you've just opened a loop in their brain. And the way that they're going to close that loop is to finish the task by responding to the email. And if they don't respond to your email, it's going to be sitting in their brain and just mildly stressing them out on a subconscious level. So I feel very strongly that companies should be much better about encouraging people, first of all, defining when emails should be sent, defining what an emergency is, and defining how an emergency should be communicated. I would suggest not by email, because if you think you're going to find out about an emergency through email, you are going to be checking email at your kid's soccer game. You're going to be checking it while you're reading them a bedtime story, right? And then also with email itself, educate people and provide the schedule send option, because some of us are going to be working outside of business hours, right? And we're going to want to do email, but you need to send that email when you close your loop in your own brain into purgatory so it doesn't open a loop in someone else's brain. And Gmail and many of the platforms now have a schedule send option, right? Where you can say, send this tomorrow at 8 or sometime when it's appropriate. So I think being much more conscious about the impact that your communication is going to have on someone else's flow, whatever they're experiencing. It might not be workflow, but you're going to be interrupting them. Be much more mindful of that and create some company-wide guidelines for that. And then on an individual level, I think that you need to carve out time. If you're going to be trying to do any kind of deep work, as Cal Newport calls it, you're going to need to eliminate distractions during that time. It's not going to work if your phone is sitting next to you, even on silent, because you're going to be, we've all been conditioned to train part of our attention on our phones at all times. So the mere presence of the phone is going to distract you, let alone if the screen is lighting up occasionally with messages.
And when it's not there, you're looking for it, right?
Exactly.
Where's my phone?
And you'll notice that if you do take it away, and you'll start to feel really twitchy. But once you get into the routine of experiencing what it's like to carve out this time for focused attention, it'll become easier. I think also that will help prevent work from bleeding over. If you set aside like an hour, or do the Pomodoro method with 20 minutes, where you set a timer and you've got 20 minutes at a time where you're trying to focus, you'll start to realize, oh, I can actually get a lot done during that time if I'm not distracted. And maybe if I have 5 or 6 of these throughout a day, like that's enough. And you start to compartmentalize. Right now, we don't have any boundaries. And so this kind of work and the anxiety surrounding work and this feeling of constant unfinished tasks is just bleeding out into all the other areas of our lives.
Yeah, so true. Oh my gosh. If you work in a geographically distributed team, it can be hard sometimes not to send emails outside of people's working hours. But
right. So that's a great example of, if you know someone's in a different time zone and it's bedtime, or it's like 4:00 in the morning, whatever, then that would be a great example of when you schedule it so that it arrives during their workday.
Yeah, totally. Unless you have multiple recipients and each person is in a different time zone. But I think this is exactly the kind of stuff that we should be thinking about, because, depending on the complexity of your team, you need to figure out what's going to be the best solution for us, and then start contracting for how are we going to deal with those things to take away the anxiety and the number of open loops that people have, as you say.
Yeah, and I really can't stress enough the impact that constant distraction is having on our creativity and our productivity and ability to get anything done. And I think most of us are living in a state right now where we don't even recognize how bad it is. It is so bad. You're so scattered. If you feel like you're constantly frazzled, there might be other stuff going on in your life, but your relationship and interactions with technology are really playing a large role in that. And it is well worth the time, for example, to go through your phone settings and look at the notification settings and bring that down to an absolute minimum. Your phone and all those apps are going to enable the notifications by default, like all of the notifications. So I would reframe those as interruptions, not notifications, because notifications like, oh, that's something that's a benefit to me. No, it's an interruption. And then say, do you really want to be interrupted by every single thing that comes through your phone? Do you really want a notification interruption from your phone to show up on your desktop computer? No, I don't think you should. You need to protect your brain, because our brains are very malleable and they will change in response to stimuli. Your brain is not going to care whether it's a positive habit or a negative habit. that's being reinforced. If certain triggers are hit upon in your brain, certain triggers for dopamine, you are going to establish a habit. And you're going to find yourself unable to focus. I like to make the point that our brains are naturally distractible because evolutionarily that makes a lot of sense. Like if you are not scanning your horizon for threats, then you actually could be attacked or eaten. So it's much better to be distractible than to be able to focus on a book if you're like an ancient human that might get eaten, right? But now the value is in being able to focus. That is a very difficult skill for our brains that they're not naturally wired to do. The fact that we can read a book is an astonishing feat. So when you're allowing your phone to constantly distract you, it's not as if you just started from a neutral baseline and now you're getting distractible. Your brain already wanted to be distractible. So I compare that to the idea of hiring a personal trainer who, instead of encouraging you to do the hard work of getting in shape, is like, oh yes, I think you should continue to sit on that couch. You should eat more potato chips. Just indulge, like you're just encouraging your brain to do what it already wants to do.
Yeah, oh my gosh. It's so important and such a difficult shift to make. I think that I turned off all the notifications on my devices a few years ago, and it has made such a huge difference to how I feel and the amounts of energy that I have. And then I also got off Facebook as the first step, and that was incredible. I think just like you, when you talked about your phone-free days and devices-free days, suddenly you discover that you have so much more time. It's incredible.
So much more time. I mean, it's even this weekend, I did that on Saturday, and I've been now I'm learning the drums too. I'm like really going hard into music. And I was like, how is it only 11 o'clock? Like I've practiced like 3 instruments, I've like played with my daughter. I mean, because time speeds up when you're on screens. It's a phenomenon known as dissociation. It actually really does your perception of time. So I would encourage people to experiment with removing it, taking a break and see how time dilates. And I also would say if an app is a problem for you, experiment with getting it off your phone. And that includes quote unquote productive work related things like email and the news. Like those were the things that were the problem for me. I would reread news, especially during, 2016 to 2020, reread news stories over and over and over again. And it was just reinforcing my anxiety. And it was not doing anything. And so I was like, I should just take the news app off my phone. I already had the notifications off. That made a huge difference. If I want to check the news now, I have to go to the browser. I have to enter my password. It's kind of just enough of a pain that I often am able to get myself to stop before I get into a spiral. And the same thing with email. I took the email app off my phone because I'm like, I'm constantly going to be checking email. Responding to an email with my thumbs is very inefficient. So I'm going to do my best to only respond from a desktop computer where I actually can touch type. That's going to save me a lot of time and stop me from getting sucked into email spirals. So I recommend that people experiment with figuring out what they could try deleting. Social media is obviously a big one for many people, but don't shy away from the ones that seem essential, like email, because you can always put them back on your phone. You can try it just for a couple hours, or you could do something where you have a schedule for yourself and it's like, all right, on Friday afternoon, I'm going to delete the mail app or take it off my phone. I'm going to reinstall it on Monday morning.
I'm sweating already just listening to you. Deleting email.
But it doesn't mean you can't check it. You just want to make it a little harder. And you could even just try it for one weekend and see what happens, experiment with it. But again, it's very interesting how it does make people sometimes literally sweat to think about that. But what's the worst that would happen? And if you're so worried something terrible is going to happen, again, establish with your team what to do if there really is an emergency, like call the person. And then maybe put a schedule for yourself where, okay, I'm going to check my email at 11 o'clock on Saturday morning and at 6:30 right before dinner to make sure nothing happened. And I'm going to do it from the desktop. There's no one right answer to this, but I'm just saying that if you were an alcoholic and you were keeping beer in the refrigerator, you're going to keep drinking. So if you have a problem with email and you keep finding yourself sucked into your inbox and it's stressing you out, just see what it's like to not have...
Make it easy on you.
Exactly. I should say I do check email from my phone occasionally, but what I have to do is go through Gmail, and then I have 2-factor authentication on. So talk about a pain in the butt to check your email. So it's like 6 steps. And again, that additional friction, to use the Silicon Valley term for what they're trying to take away, they want it to be frictionless. I add friction for the things I'm trying to do less, and then I try to reduce friction for the activities I'm trying to do more of. Like make it, leave my guitar out of its case so I'm more likely to practice it. Going back to what you were saying about the little 15-minute, like little chunks of time. Like, what could I do during those little pockets of time that would leave me feeling more energized and purposeful and happy than what I typically would do, which would be the news or email or, for many people, social media.
Yeah, totally. I love it. Oh my gosh. I wish we could speak longer, but I want to be respectful of your time. We have one final section on the show, which we call the rapid fire questions. And I have 5 questions for you. And the goal here is for you to answer all these questions in under 2 minutes. All right, so let's go. At CultureBrained, we are on a mission to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. So what is your number 1 tip to bring more fun to the workplace?
Focus on increasing the opportunities for playfulness and connection and flow, and also helping people recognize the moments of playfulness and connection and flow that are already naturally occurring within the workplace.
What is a sign, or perhaps signs in plural, that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Probably one of the main ones is if no one wants to come back to the office ever.
It's happening everywhere now.
Yeah, and if you have real problems with retention, which I know many companies are having, those are not good signs. Culture would lead to more retention.
Do you have any companies in mind that you admire for the culture? And if yes, why?
I recently did a talk for West Monroe, and I really, really admired their culture. They're the company that does the round the horn tradition. They also have a tradition and a ritual where if anybody lands a new client or does something noteworthy, they have a bell in the office and they run up and they ring the bell and everyone pays attention to them. And they then spend a couple of minutes saying what they just accomplished and then giving credit to their team members. And they did this in the context of the company-wide retreat also. So the CEO was on stage giving his introduction, and I think at least 3 separate times, someone just ran up on stage in the middle of his talk and rang the bell, and
What?
he celebrated
Wow.
that. So it was this feeling of playfulness and community that I think really helps them stand out.
Mm-hmm. What books on culture, leadership, philosophy, anything really, should our listeners read?
These are not business books per se, but 3 that stand out to me that I've really enjoyed are The Power of Ritual, The Art of Gathering, and The Art of Gathering is by Priya Parker, and that's about creating more meaningful connections with people. And The Book of Delights is a lovely book that can help you just focus on the positive and then may perhaps inspire you to bring that more into your workplace culture as well.
Wonderful. And final question. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is just that delight practice I was talking about, is to just introduce the concept of noticing and sharing delights and creating delight for other people and see where that takes you.
Love it. Catherine, thank you so much for this conversation. If our listeners want to learn more about you, about your work, what are the best online places for them to visit?
I would suggest they go to screenlifebalance.com, screenlifebalance.com, and you'll find a collection of resources there, information on both How to Break Up With Your Phone and The Power of Fun. I actually have courses based on both of those books also that, in an ironic twist, will deliver the course content to you through your phone. So your phone will actually break up with you, which I kind of love. And I would suggest that people sign up for my newsletter on that site. So screenlifebalance.com and sign up for the newsletter, as I try to give regular suggestions for, as I put it, how to scroll less and live more.
I love it. Thank you so much again. It was so much fun.
Thank you very much.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis and Labarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Catherine and I hope that you got inspired by what we talked about and that you will look for ways to generate more fun in your workplace. Not the fun that comes with ping pong tables or Friday pizza parties, but the joy of work itself. If you'd like an opportunity to interact with Catherine and other guests of the Culture Lab podcast, you might consider joining the CultureBrained community. CultureBrained is a one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you're in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, I think it's probably feel right at home in our community. You can learn more about CultureBrained at tinyurl.com/CultureBrained, and you'll find the link in the show notes. And now it's time for the preview of our next episode. And this time, I have a huge pleasure to bring you a woman I have admired for a long time, Professor Linda Grattan. Linda Grattan is one of the foremost global thought leaders on the future of work. She was named by Business Thinkers 50 as one of the top 15 business thinkers, and she was described as a rock star teacher. She's a professor of management practice at London Business School, where she received the Teacher of the Year award and where she designed and directed the Future of Work elective. It's probably one of the school's most popular electives, if not the most popular one. Her research on hybrid work was featured as the cover article for Harvard Business Review in May 2021, and Linda explores issues of work in her MIT Sloan column as well. Now, in this snippet in the preview of the next episode, Linda Grattan talks about the process of redesigning work.
The first is that I saw redesign as a system, as a design process. And so the design process goes like any other design process, which is to understand what you have, to reimagine what could be, to test and model that, and then to try and embed it in the organization. Those are four steps. And those are normal design steps. I was with the Royal College of Art group yesterday, and any designer is aware of those steps. But I think what's particular about the redesign of work is the understanding phase, because it seems to me, and coming back to your earlier question, that there are three things we need to understand. We need to understand people, their motivations, their life stage, their aspirations. But we also need to understand the job. What is it that the job requires? What is this job about? And thirdly, we need to understand the connections and the networks that bring people together.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser. tinyurl.com/agabayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.